Thank you so much. I'm reminded of the member of Knesset in Israel who asked for the right to speak, and the Speaker of the House admonished him. He said, "You have the right to speak, but you're confined to 5 minutes." And the parliamentarian said, "I accept, but before I begin, I'd like to say a few words." Before I begin, I would like to say my heartfelt thank you to everyone here, Mr. Rowan. Needless to say, to a gentleman here whom I admire greatly, who has created all of this, Ken Quinn. And now I wish to tell you something about water use efficiency and irrigation. Since ancient times, traditional irrigation had been based on the seasonal inundation of land in the floodplains along rivers, when those rivers were in spate. Seasonally, these rivers rose, overflowed their so-called floodplains, and saturated the soil. And some hundreds of years or thousands of years after the advent of farming in the rain-fed areas of the ancient Fertile Crescent, in the hills and intermontane valleys, which received the benefit of seasonal rainfall sufficiently to allow the growth of domesticated plants that became crops, wheat and barley and oats and rye and lentils and some of the fruit trees, pomegranates and almonds and so on. Some hundreds or thousands of years later, people learned to take the seeds of the crops and plant them along the river valleys after the recession of the floods, when the soil was completely saturated. And so crops could be grown utilizing the moisture stored in the soil between successive riverine floodings. Under this system, the soil underwent alternating cycles between brief saturation and gradual extraction of moisture, leading to eventual desiccation. Soil moisture thus shifted from one extreme condition to the opposite extreme, from satiation, that is excess moisture, and therefore restricted oxygen supply to roots. Roots need to respire the same as do leaves and stems and so on. Plant needs to respire, and it does not have what we have, which are lungs and a circulating system able to transfer oxygen and into the various parts of our body and then exhale carbon dioxide. Roots need to respire. Of most mesophytic plants, that is, most crop plants. And so, in the traditional mode of riverine irrigation, soils were alternately excessively wet, limiting respiration of roots, and then gradually desiccated so that the roots and the plants began to suffer what is called moisture stress. And when irrigation was supplied in excess, the water table began to rise. Water table rising produces a process of capillary rise and evaporation, enhanced evaporation at the surface, which concentrates salts. And so gradually, river valley irrigation in the ancient Near East that is, in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile and the Indus River Valley, underwent a process of waterlogging and, in some cases, salinization. People who read about the history of these ancient civilizations read about the kings that rise and the battles that are fought, but they don't often realize, nor do classical historians, that what undermines civilizations very often is mismanagement of land and water and crops and agriculture, the very basis of subsistence, the very basis of life. So that was the problem with infrequent periodic flooding. Over the centuries, these processes were continued, and civilization after civilization, not only in the ancient Middle East, the so-called cradle of civilization, but also in farther east and in recent times in Central Asia and in the Americas as well. Irrigation was not sustainable. Now, the irrigation of Egypt, by the way, was an unusual and unusually stable. And that is because over most of its length, the Nile River runs below the level of the land. It cuts its course so that periodically when the river drained, it also carried away the excess salts. Therefore, the civilization of Egypt was more stable, not entirely so, but more stable than the civilization of Mesopotamia and then the Indus River Valley and so on. But in recent years, we know, in recent decades, the Egyptians, because of the increase in population, the statistic is startling, by the way. As far as we know, as far as archaeologists and historians are able to reconstruct the history of Egypt, its population fluctuated over the many centuries, the millennia of Egyptian civilization, between about 1.5 million and 2.5 million, perhaps as many as 3 million. And that was indeed the size of the population of Egypt in the early part of the 19th century, around something like 200 years ago, when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1797 or so. And he brought with him demographers. His interest, of course, was disrupting the British Empire and fighting and so on and so forth. But incidentally, he brought some scientists and demographers who studied Egypt and established what is known as the science of Egyptology. And they even deciphered, they found the Rosetta Stone and were able to decipher the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and read the records of the past civilization. And among other things they did was to count the population of Egypt, and they found it, as I said before, to be of the order of 2.5 to 3 million. What do you guess the population of Egypt is today? Anyone else? We're holding an auction here. 80, okay. It rises inexorably, about 1.5 million per a few years, and so it is now nearing 90 million. That is at least a 30-fold increase on the same land and water base. And this requires tremendous intensification, and for that purpose, the Egyptians rightly sponsored the damming of the Nile with the aid of the Soviet Union, and the damming of the Nile holds back the water so that they are now able to deliver the water continuously, perennially, every month of the year. They have all that water stored behind the Aswan High Dam, and now the land is no longer flushed annually. And the soils of Egypt, especially along the Nile Delta, are undergoing a gradual process of salinization. That was the process to which Egyptian civilization seemed immune over the many centuries. The civilization of Mesopotamia and of the Indus River Valley farther east succumbed to that. In modern times, the same pattern of irrigation was used: riverine irrigation, drawing water from the rivers, applying water to the land. And in Central Asia, we have the example of Uzbekistan and the valley of the Amu Darya and Sir Darya flowing into the Aral Sea, that is a lake in Central Asia. The extraction of water during the Soviet time in that part of the world, they wanted to raise a lot of cotton. And so they decided that they were going to divert the waters of these rivers that feed this beautiful, once brimming lake of the Aral Sea. And they diverted the water, and they began to produce a lot of cotton for the textile mills of the Soviet Union. And lo and behold, that lake began to shrink, and the irrigation with excess water raised the water table, increased the evaporation and the concentration of salts, and now vast areas in the Amu Darya and Sir Darya valleys are severely salinized, and the Aral Sea, that beautiful lake that was once brimming with water and filled with fish, now shrunken, and you can see vast salt flats. I was there not very many years ago to advise on rehabilitation of that land, and I was astonished. Similar processes are occurring everywhere, particularly in arid regions where water is diverted for irrigation and irrigation is applied in excess. But that model of irrigation was used in the United States as well. The Mormon people in Utah were the first to divert the waters of a river that they called the Jordan River, patterned after in their devotion to the biblical writ, similar to the Jordan River, which itself, by the way, is now undergoing a process of salination by diversion and the deprivation of the inflow to the Dead Sea and so on. These processes are very typical and very widespread in arid regions. Now, in the 20th century, sprinkler irrigation systems were developed. So water no longer needed to be conveyed through open canals and with excess seepage and flooding of the land periodically. You could apply water by sprinkling. And that was more economical, but it required pressure and expensive equipment. And therefore, to economize, people tried to use portable sprinkling tubes. The tubes were aluminum or steel, and steel tended to corrode, so aluminum piping seemed the order of the day, but that needed to be shifted from place to place, and once again, it was repeated low-frequency, high-volume irrigation. And a theory was developed by professors at the University of California that water in the soil is equally available to plants from what they called field capacity, that is the maximum amount of water that the soil can hold, down to the wilting point of plants. theory of infrequent irrigation. You come back and irrigate every week or 2 or 3 or 4 when moisture in the soil is depleted to the point where plants are just about to wilt. So this theory of equal availability for many decades was de rigueur. It was the standard theory. Equal availability, wilting point, field capacity. Then, in a faraway little country called Israel, people came into the practice of irrigation, and these people were not old-time farmers. They were new to the entire practice of irrigation, and therefore they were willing to try new things. And it occurred to them that maybe if we apply the water slowly, 1 drop at a time, instead of flooding the land, instead of high volume, low frequency, let's apply the water at low volume, high frequency, or continuously. And the idea was an interesting idea, and it was, in fact, it was not entirely new. People out in the western states in the post-war years conceived a similar idea and developed, because agriculture is practiced in the United States on a larger scale, especially in the West, they developed these center pivot irrigation systems that turned around. You can see when you fly over these states in the West, you see these circular, a pattern of circular green fields. Water pumped through vertical pipes, and there's a horizontal boom that circles around continuously and drips water. And that system was really a system of high frequency, lower volume, but still a high volume. But it could not be applied throughout the world because these are very expensive rigs and they require high pressure and large volumes of water. People in North Africa, centuries before, had conceived of a very ingenious and very simple way of irrigating. When they planted trees, they buried ceramic pots next to the saplings, next to the tree plantings, and filled them periodically every week or 2, and these unglazed ceramic pots, the porous pots, oozed the water into the root zone. That was an ingenious way to do it, but it did not spread very far from there. The idea of high-frequency, low-volume irrigation suddenly became practical in the post-war years, post-World War years, especially in the late 50s and early 60s, when weathering-resistant plastic tubing, PVC and polyethylene tubing, became available, and it was cheap. It was a byproduct of the petroleum industry. And these tubes, very narrow tubes, not much more than ½ an inch or an inch in diameter, could be perforated, or could be made porous, or could be punctured and little emitters attached to them. So the water could be applied continuously at the base of a plant into the root system. And in response to the needs of the plant. A young plant requires little water, an older plant requires a little bit more water, and you can fine-tune the delivery of water in response to weather conditions, whether there's a heat wave or a rainstorm. During a rainstorm, you don't have to apply any water, but during a heat wave, you need to apply a lot of water, and during season, of course, and in response to the stage of growth of the plant. That was the essence of drip irrigation. Such a simple idea. Later on, people found ways of improving the system. For example, you could inject fertilizers into the water supply so that you feed the plants as well as water them. You could even inject pesticides into the water wherever necessary to overcome diseases or other problems that the plant encounters. And this simple idea spread. Another variation is to apply water through porous tubes that have many, many little, not perforations, but many little pores. And the tubes can be placed below the surface of the ground so that the tube, this porous plastic tube, oozes water into the root zone. There are many variants. And this then, of course, requires ancillary devices such as pressure control so that the pressure doesn't fluctuate, and in addition to that, fertilizer injection, pesticide injection as necessary. This simple idea spread. It is now gone irrigation from low frequency, high volume to high frequency, low volume irrigation. High frequency or continuous. And other variants of it are micro sprinklers that can spread the water depending on whether in the soil water spreads laterally or just goes vertically and so on. And lo and behold, the crop per drop. If I made that noise, it was on purpose. I want you to remember, crop per drop. So, that is the essence, and the development of flexible portable pipes made the low-cost plastic materials available, and the rest is history. But now we have another problem, an entirely different problem, unanticipated. Before the Industrial Revolution, the atmosphere contained something like 270, give or take, parts per million of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has an interesting property. It allows the penetration, or it transmits radiation of a certain type, that is shortwave radiation, but it does not allow, it inhibits the transmission of long-wave radiation. Long-wave radiation is heat radiation. It happens that we receive on Earth the short-wave radiation from the sun, and it is absorbed by the ground, the soil, the rocks, plants, and then what they emit is long-wave radiation. Depends, of course, on the temperature of the radiating body. Long-wave radiation dissipated, except for this greenhouse effect that makes the Earth's surface warmer than it would be otherwise if it didn't have an atmosphere inhibiting the out transmission of this long-wave radiation. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning more and more fossil fuels. Coal, and then petroleum and its various derivatives. And we have enriched the atmosphere, quote unquote, the atmosphere from about 270 parts per million to very nearly 400 parts per million. We're well on our way to doubling the concentration of carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is not the only so-called greenhouse gas. Why greenhouse? Because it resembles the effect of a plate of glass, transmitting light and inhibiting the outflow of heat. There are other gases. There's methane, there's nitrous oxide, and all of these have been increasing. Ozone as well. And so we are in the process of warming the surface of the earth. Nobody suspected that until not very many decades ago. Nobody quite noticed that. It was predicted by some scientists, but largely ignored. So we are now projecting. Various calculations by scientists project that the temperature is due to rise by perhaps 4 degrees Celsius on average by the end of the century. And this may be associated with a reduction of rainfall in some areas and altogether more extreme weather events. A warmer world is a more intense world weather-wise. And furthermore, the melting of ice caps would cause the rising of sea levels and threaten to reduce agricultural yields in some regions, particularly along coasts, and maybe to inundate a city or two, perhaps New York, perhaps London, a few other large or small cities. And so it is a serious matter, a very serious matter. And the risk is very high. There is some controversy over this, but the science seems, in principle, very clear. Quantitatively, there are still some doubts, because we can only project into the future using models, and models are, in some ways, figments of the imagination, or they portray mathematically what we perceive to be the major processes and properties of the Earth system. So there's not any great certainty, but there is a high probability that the temperature will rise significantly in the next few decades, by the middle of this century. Agriculture is involved in this because agriculture is an emitter. It's a net emitter. When we clear land and begin cultivating, the original store of organic matter in the soil is rapidly decomposed, and the soil then spews out carbon dioxide, and if the soil is saturated, then it will also spew out nitrous oxide and methane. So we need to change the mode of agriculture. We need to be able to irrigate more judiciously to prevent saturation of the soil, to prevent the erosion of soil, to conserve soil. Agriculture is a component, an important component. And agriculture can play a very positive role because in many cases, the soils can be changed from net emitters to net absorbers. We can enrich the soil with organic matter. In the process, increase soil fertility and improve soil structure. And so agriculture can either play a negative role or a positive role depending on how we manage it. I could be talking about this endlessly, but I want to make a plea here for improving agriculture, improving the yield per unit of land so that we don't have to extensify agriculture. We don't have to destroy natural ecosystems by expanding agriculture needlessly and then degrading the land. We have to intensify agriculture, letting ecosystems remain natural ecosystems, tending them. The Bible tells us, the first chapter of the book of Genesis tells us that God placed the human Adam. What's Adam? We don't know Adam from Adam in English. But in Hebrew, Adam is the masculine form of the noun Adama, meaning earth. Therefore, Adam means literally earthling, of the earth. And Eve, which we mispronounce, the original name is Chava, meaning life. Therefore, Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, mean literally soil and life. There's powerful symbolism in this. When they began to abuse their privileges, they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. It's for us now to stop abusing soil and water, to fulfill our real destiny, being stewards of the land, stewards of the water, stewards of the earth, and return to the Garden of Eden. Now I want to tell you a story before I finish. In the lore of the much too conflicted Middle East, there's an old story called the War of Bassus. In ancient times, so the story goes, two neighboring tribes had coexisted in a tenuous state of peace. They shared a single well located on the boundary between their territories. Each tribe had access to the water from its own side of the common trough. One day, a camel belonging to one tribe wandered across the boundary and drank water from the wrong side. Incensed at this breach of his tribe's sacred territorial rights, the son of the sheikh, whose realm had been violated, rose up in anger and killed the offender. Alas, that hapless creature just happened to belong to the son of the neighboring sheikh, who then rose in anger to smite the killer of his beloved camel. There began a blood feud between the two tribes that lasted 5 generations and cost the lives of countless people on both sides. It was known as the War of Bassus, though no one remembered that Bassus, the original cause of the strife, was only an errant camel. When the conflict eventually ended, neither tribe could claim victory, and both were relieved to reestablish their reciprocal arrangement. Even the self-generating hatred born of this violence could not prevail over the imperative to resolve the dispute and restore an equitable water supply for all. That's my message.